18. The day of the gathering was approaching. As near as was palpable in the village, people began to finish projects and delayed the start of new ones. Kira noticed that in the weaving shed, fabrics were folded and stacked, but the looms were not restrung. The noise level subsided, as if people were distracted with preparations and didn't want to waste time with the usual bickering. Some people washed. In his room, Thomas was meticulously polishing the singer's staff again and again. He used thick oils and rubbed them into the wood with a soft cloth. Smooth and golden, it began to take on a glow and fragrance. Matt did not return. It had been many days now since he had disappeared. At night, before she slept, Kira held the scrap of cloth that had so often assured her fears and even answered her questions. She wrapped it around her fingers and concentrated on Matt. She pictured the laughing boy and saw some feeling of where he might be and where he was safe. A feeling of reassurance, of solace, came from the scrap, but no answer. They could occasionally hear the voice of the small singer, Joe, during the day. The crying had ceased. Most often they heard repetitive chanting, the same phrases over and over, though sometimes, as if she were allowed a moment of her own, the high lyrical voice soared into melodies that made Kira hold her breath in awe. She crept down at night with the key in her hand and visited the dike. Joe had stopped asking for her mother, but she clung to Kira in the darkness. Together, they whispered little stories and jokes. Kira brushed Joe's hair. I could thump with the hairbrush if I needed, Joe reminded her, looking up at the ceiling. Yes, and we would come. Kira stroked Joe's soft cheek. Won't I should make a song for you? Joe asked. Someday, Kira told her, but not now. We mustn't make noise in the night. It must be our secret that I come here. I'd be thinking up a song, Joe said, and someday I sing it for you horrid loud. All right, Kira laughed. The gathering be soon, Joe said importantly. Yes, I know. I'd be right up front, they say. Good for you. So you'll be able to see everything. You'll be able to see the beautiful singer's robe. I've been working on it, Kira told her. It has wonderful colors. When I be singer, the tyke confided, then I can make my own songs again, if I learn the old ones good. The Jameson came to her room. Kira showed him that the repairs to the robe were complete. He was obviously pleased with her work. Together, they spread the fabrics across the table, turning it, unfolding its pleating and cuffs, examining the intricate stitches and the seams they created. You've done a fine job, Kira, he said, particularly here. He pointed to a place that she recalled had been difficult for her. Though tiny in size, as such embroidered scene was, it was a complicated portrayal of tall buildings in shades of gray, each of them toppling against the background of fiery explosions. Kira had matched oranges and reds of different shades and had found the various grays for the smoke and the buildings. But the threading had been hard for her because she had no sense of what the buildings were. She had never seen anything like them. The council edifice in which she lived and worked was the only large building she knew, and it was small compared to these. These, before they toppled, had seemed extended up into the sky to amazing heights, much, much higher than any tree she had ever seen. That was the hardest part, she told Jameson. It was so complicated. Perhaps if I had known more about the buildings, about what happened to them, she was embarrassed. I should have paid more attention to the ruins song each year, she confessed. I was always so excited when it began, but then my mind would wander a bit, and I didn't always listen carefully. You were young, Jameson reminded her, and the song is very, very long. No one listened carefully to every part, and especially not the tykes. This year, I will, Kira told him. This year, I'll be paying special attention because I know the scene so well. I'll be listening especially for this scene with the buildings falling. Jameson closed his eyes. She could see his lips move silently. He started to hum, and she recognized a recurrent melody from part of the song. Then he began to chant aloud. Burn, scourged world, furious furnace, infernal impure. He opened his eyes. I believe that's the part, he said. He goes on and on after that. I forget the next words, but I believe that's the part where the buildings toppled. Of course, I've listened to the song for many more years than you. I can't imagine how the singer remembers it all, Kira said. For a moment, she thought of asking him about the captive child below, the singer of the future, who was being forced to learn the interminable song, but she hesitated, and the moment passed. Of course, he has the staff as a guide, Jamieson said. And he began the learning when he was just a small tyke. That was a very long time ago, and he rehearsed constantly. While you've been preparing his robe, he's been preparing this year's song. The words are always the same, of course, but I believe he decides each year to emphasize certain parts. He studies all year, planning and rehearsing the singing of it. Where? He has special quarters in a different section of the edifice. I've never seen him except at the time of the song. No, he stays apart. They turned again to the rope, examining each section to be certain that Kira had missed nothing. A tender brought tea and they sat together, talking of the robe and its stories, and of the history it told, of the time before the ruin. Jamieson closed his eyes again and recited, Ravaged all, Bogo Tabal, Timor Toron, Totu now gone. Kira recognized the lines, some of her favorites, though she didn't understand them. As a tyke, the rhyming sounds had charmed her out of the boredom she often felt during the interminable song. Bogo Tabal, Timor Toron, she had chanted to herself at times. What does it mean, that section? She asked Jamieson now. I believe it tells the names of lost places, he explained. I wonder what those places looked like. Timor Toron, I like the sounds. That's part of your job, Jamieson reminded her. You used the threads to remind us of how they looked. Kira nodded and smoothed the robe again, finding the tragic-toplic cities and the interspersed meadows of soft greens. Jamieson set his teacup on the table, went to the window, and looked down. The workers are finished. After the gathering and this year's song, you'll be able to start dyeing new threads for the robe. She looked up, dismayed, hoping to see by his expression that he was making a small joke, but his look was solemn. Kira had thought that when this work was complete, she could turn to her own projects, to some of the elaborate patterns that she could feel and see in her mind. Sometimes her fingers quivered with the desire to make those scenes. Will the robe become so damaged during the song that it will need repairing again? She asked him, trying not to show how distressing the thought was to her. She wanted to please him. He had been her protector, but she didn't want to keep doing this forever. No, no, his voice was reassuring. Your mother kept up with the small repairs each year, and now you've very capably redone the places that needed restoration. After this year's song, there will probably be only a few scattered broken threads for you to fix. Then, Kira was puzzled. Jamieson reached toward the robe and gestured at the empty, undone expanse across the shoulders. Here lies the future, he said, and now you will tell it to us, with your fingers and your threads, he told her. His eyes had a piercing, excited look. She tried to conceal her shock. So soon? She murmured. He had referred to this enormous task before, but she had thought that when she was older, when she had more skill, more knowledge. We have waited a long time for you, he said, and looked at her firmly, as if he dared her to refuse. 19. It began early. At dawn, Kira could hear the sounds, even from a room on the opposite side of the building, as the people started to gather. Quickly, she finished dressing, pulled the brush through her hair, and ran to Thomas's room on the other side of the corridor. From there, they could look down at the plaza where all large gatherings took place. Unlike the day of the hunt, this crowd was subdued. Even small tykes, usually so unruly, clung to their mothers' hands and waited quietly. The sound that had awakened Kira was not shouts and jostling, but simply the tread of feet as the people streamed up the narrow lanes and moved into the throng waiting to enter the building. From the fan path came a steady flow of silent citizens, clutching and leading their tykes. From the opposite direction, from the area where Kira and her mother had lived, came others whom she recognized from her old neighborhood. There was her mother's widowed brother with his boy, Dan, but the small girl, Mar, was not with him. Perhaps she had been given away. On a typical day, families were scattered and apart, tykes scampering unsupervised, parents at work. But today, hobbies stood with their wives and tykes with their families. The people seemed solemn and expectant. "Where's the staff?" Kira asked, looking around Thomas's room. "They took it yesterday." Kira nodded. They had come and taken the robe yesterday as well. Weary thought she was of the work. Her room seemed diminished with it gone. "Should we go down?" she asked them, though she didn't relish the prospect of joining the crowd. "No, they said they'd come for us. I asked the tender who brought my breakfast." "Look," Thomas pointed. "Over there, way in the back. See, by the tree just before the weaving shed. Isn't that Matt's mother?" Kira followed his pointing finger with her eyes and found the same gaunt woman who had eyed them suspiciously from the squalor of the cot. Today she was washed and tidy. Beside her, holding her hand, was the tyke who looked so much like Matt. The two stood waiting as a family, but there was no second child, no Matt. A wave of sorrow swept through Kira, a feeling of loss. Looking down at the sea of faces, Kira gradually recognized people here and there. The weaving women, separate from each other, each with a hubby and children. The butcher, clean for a change, with his large wife and two tall sons. The entire village had gathered now, only a few stragglers still hurrying up the lanes. A small surge of movement began, and she could see that the people were shuffling forward. The crowd rippled like water moving on the riverbank when a log floated by. "The doors must have been opened," Thomas said, leaning forward to see. They watched as the entire village, person by person, entered the building. Finally, when the crowd outside was almost entirely gone, and now they could hear the murmur of voices and the shuffle of footsteps from below, inside the building, a tender appeared in Thomas's doorway and beckoned. "It's time," the tender said. Except for a quick peek through a cracked open door when she looked for Jamieson one afternoon, Kira had not seen inside the Council of Guardians Hall since the day of her trial months before. The circumstances had been so different then, when she entered the cavernous room and limped alone down its central aisle hungry, lonely, and fearful for her life. Today she still leaned, as she had that day, on her stick, but now she was clean, healthy, and unafraid. Today she and Thomas were brought through a side entrance near the front, so that they saw the faces of the village watching them. The tender pointed, directing them to a row of 3 wooden chairs on the left, just below the stage, facing the audience. Kira could see that there was another longer row of chairs on the opposite side, as she recognized the Council of Guardians members who were already seated there. Jamieson was among them. Quickly reminding herself of the custom, she bowed her head toward the worship object on the stage. Then she followed Thomas, and together they took their places in 2 of the chairs. A murmur passed through the audience, and Kira felt her face flush in embarrassment. She didn't like being singled out. She didn't want to sit here at the front. She remembered the derisive voice of one of the weavers only a few days before. "She don't need us no more," the woman had called. "It's not true. I need all of you. We need each other." Gazing at the crowded audience, Kira remembered the many past years when she had come dutifully with her mother to the gathering. Always they sat in the back where she couldn't see or hear, and she had endured the event bored and restless, sometimes kneeling on her seat to try to peer around the spectators' shoulders and get a glimpse of the singer. Her mother, she remembered, had always been attentive and had gently restrained her when she wriggled in the seat. But the gathering and the song were long and difficult for Tykes. The people in the crowded audience, who though respectful had been shifting in their seats and whispering, quieted completely when Kira and Thomas entered and took their places. Everyone waited. Finally, in the silence, the four-syllable chief guardian, whom Kira had not seen since the trial, and whose name she still could not recall, was it Bartholomew, perhaps, rose from his seat on the other side. He walked to the space at the front of the stage and began the ritual that always opened the ceremony. "The gathering begins," he announced. "We worship the object," he said, gesturing toward the stage and bowing. The entire audience bowed respectfully toward the little cross construction of wood. "I present the Council of Guardians," he said next, and nodded to the row of men, which included Jamieson. As a group, they stood. For a nervous moment, Kira couldn't remember if the spectators were supposed to applaud, but a hush had fallen, and the crowd was silent, though some had seemed to nod toward the Council of Guardians in respect. "For the first time, I represent the carver of the future." His gesture toward Thomas, who looked uncertain. "Stand," Kira whispered under her breath, knowing intuitively that it was the proper thing to do. Thomas stood awkwardly, shifting from one foot to the other. Again, heads nodded in respect. He sat back down. She knew that she would be next, and she reached for her stick, which was leaning against the chair. "For the first time, I present the rope threader, the designer of the future." Kira stood as straight as she could and acknowledged the nods in her direction. She said again, "For the first time, I present the singer of the future. One day she will wear the robe." The eyes of the villagers all turned to the side door, which had opened. Kira could see two tenders push Joe forward, pointing to the unoccupied chair. The tyke, dressed in a new but simple and unadorned gown, looked confused and uncertain, but her eyes found Kira's, and Kira beckoned to her, smiling. Joe grinned and hurried forward toward the chair. "Don't sit yet," Kira whispered. "Stand and look at the people. Be proud." With a shy grin, with one foot nervously rubbing the ankle of the other leg, the singer of the future stood and faced the crowd. Her smile, hesitant at first, quickly became both self-confident and infectious. Kira could see the people smile back. "Now you can sit," Kira whispered. "Wait," Joe whispered back. She raised one hand and waggled her fingers at the audience. A ripple of gentle laughter ran through the large crowd. Then Joe turned and hoisted her small self, knees first, onto the chair. "I be giving them a little wavy," she confided to Kira. "Finally, I present our singer, who wears the robe," the chief guardian announced when the people had quieted. The singer, wearing the magnificent robe and holding the carved staff in his right hand, entered from the other side. The crowd gasped collectively. Of course, they saw him and the robe each year. But this year was different because of the work that Kira had done on the ancient embroidery. As the singer moved toward the stage, his folds of the robe glistened in the torchlight. The colors of the threaded scenes glowed in their subtlety. Golds, light yellows deepening to vibrant orange, reds from the palest pink to the darkest crimson. Greens, all shades, threaded in their intricate patterns, told the history of the world and its ruin. As he turned to mount the few stairs to the stage, Kira could see the broad blank expanse across the singer's back and shoulders, the blank that she had been picked to fill, the future that she had been chosen to create. "What's that noise?" Thomas murmured. Kira had been distracted by her awareness and appreciation of the robe and all that it meant, but now she heard it too, a dull, intermittent metallic noise, a muted clank. Now it was gone. There, she heard it again, a scraping clank. "I don't know," she whispered back. The singer turned at the center of the stage, after bowing slightly to the worship object, and now faced the audience. He fingered the staff like a talisman, but did not need its guidance yet. His face was impassive, expressionless. Then he closed his eyes and began to breathe deeply. The mysterious sound had disappeared. Kira listened carefully, but the muted scrape had subsided. Looking at Thomas, she shrugged and settled back to listen. She glanced at Joe and could see that the tyke's eyes were closed too, and she was forming the first words silently with her mouth. The singer held up one arm, and Kira, from her knowledge of the rope, knew that he was displaying the sleeve with the scene of the word's origin, the separation of land and sea, the emergence of fish and birds, all of it in the tiny stitches around the border of the left sleeve, aloft now with his arm outstretched. She could feel the odd admiration of the audience as they saw the rope displayed for the first time in a year, and she felt pride in the work she had done. He started in a strong, rich baritone voice. No melody yet, really. The song began with a chant. Gradually, melodies would enter, Kira recalled, some slow, soaring lyrical phrases, followed by other harsher phrases with a quick pulsating beat. But it emerged slowly, as the world had. The song began with the origin of the world, so many centuries before, in the beginning. 20. Thomas nudged her and gestured with his head. Kira glanced over and smiled to see Joe, so eager and squirming earlier, now sound asleep in the big chair. It was late morning and the song had continued for several hours. Probably many of the tykes in the large hall were dozing, as Joe was. Kira was surprised not to be bored and drowsy herself. But for her, the song was also a journey through the patterned folds, and as the singer sang, holding up the related parts, she remembered each scene and the days of work, the search through Annabella's threads for exactly the right shades. Though she remained attentive, occasionally her mind wandered to her own task that loomed ahead. Now that the old dyer's threads were almost gone, and the woman herself was gone too, Kira found herself desperately hoping that she would be able to remember and to create the dyes alone. Thomas drilled her again and again from his written pages. Though Kira had told no one, not even Thomas, she had realized recently, to her surprise, that she could read many of the words. Watching his finger on the page one day, she had noticed that goldenrod and greenwood began the same way, with a looping downward curve, and they ended the same way too, with a little twig-like upright line. It was like a game, to find the marks that made the sounds. A forbidden game, to be sure, but Kira found herself puzzling over it often when Thomas wasn't watching, and the puzzles had begun to explain themselves to her. The singer was in a quiet section now, one of those times following a great world disaster in which ice, white and gray sheet of it, made with small stitches so that it had no texture but instead an airy, glistening smoothness, had engulfed the villages. Kira saw ice very seldom, only occasionally in the very coldest months when sleet struck the village, breaking tree branches and the river froze near its banks. But she had remembered the fearsomeness and destruction of it when she worked on that section, and had felt glad when beyond the edges of the ice disaster, green sipped in again and a quiet, fruitful time ensued. He slid into the singing of the green part now, melodic and soothing, a relief after frigid destruction that had made his voice harsh and forbidding. Thomas leaned over and nudged her again. She glanced at Joe, but the tyke had not moved. "Look down the aisle on the right," Thomas whispered. She did, and saw nothing. "Keep watching," Thomas murmured. The singer's voice continued. Kira watched the side aisle. Suddenly, she saw it. Something moving stealthily, slowly, stopping now and then, and waiting, then creeping forward again. People's heads blocked her view. Kira leaned slightly to the right, trying to see around them, trying not to let the Council of Guardians know that something disruptive was happening. She glanced at them, but they were all attentive and focused on the singer. It moved again in the shadows, and she could see now that it was human, a small human, on all fours like a stalking beast. She could see, too, that people sitting on the edge of the aisle were beginning to notice, though they kept their eyes toward the stage. There was a very small stir, shoulders turning slightly, quick glances, expressions of surprise. The small human crept forward again, inching stealthily closer to the first row. As he approached, it was easier for Kira to watch without changing her position, since her chair faced the audience, away from the stage. Finally, as the intruder reached the edge of the first row, he stopped creeping, squatted, and looked forward toward the stage, toward Kira, Joe, and Thomas. With a grin, Kira's heart leaped. Matt! She didn't dare to speak aloud, but she mouthed the words silently. He wiggled his fingers in a wave. The singer inched his fingers up the staff, feeling for the place, and continued. Matt grinned and opened one hand to show her something, but the light was dim. Kira didn't recognize what he held. He held it up between his thumb and finger, displaying it to her importantly. She shook her head slightly, indicating that she couldn't tell what it was. Then, feeling guilty at her lapse in attention, she turned and began to watch the stage and the singer again. Soon, she knew there would be an intermission, a break for lunch. She would figure out a way to catch up with the tyke then, and examine and admire whatever he had brought. Kira listened to the singer's voice as he sang the serene melody of plentiful harvests and celebratory feasting. This part of the song coincided with her own feelings at the moment. She experienced an enormous sense of relief and joy, now that Matt had returned and was safe. When she looked back, he had crept away again, and the aisle was empty. May the little singer have lunch with Thomas and me? It was the midday interruption of the gathering, a lengthy gap in the day for the food and rest. The tender pondered Kira's question and agreed. Leaving by this side door through which they had entered, Kira and Thomas, accompanied by Joe, yawning, went up the stairs to Kira's room and waited for their food to be brought. On the plaza outside, the people would be eating the food they had brought with them and discussing the song. They would be anticipating the next section, a time of warfare, conflict, and death. Kira remembered it, the bright splatters of blood and crimson threads, but she put it out of her mind now. While Thomas and Joe began on the large lunch that appeared on a tray, she hurried across the hall to Thomas's room to look down from the window and scan the crowd for a dirty-faced tyke and a bent-tailed dog. But there was no need to search from the window. They were waiting for her in Thomas's room. Matt! Kira cried. She set her stick aside, sat on the bed, and took him into her arms. Branch danced at her feet, his eager nose and tongue damp on her ankles. I've been on a horrid long journey, Matt told her proudly. She sniffed and smiled. And you never washed, not once, while you were gone. There'd be no time for washing, he scoffed. I brung you a giftie, he told her eagerly, his eyes dancing with excitement. What was it that you held up at the gathering? I couldn't see it. I brung you two things, a big and a little, the big becoming still, but I got the little here in my pocket. He dug one hand deep into his pocket and pulled out a handful of nuts and a dead grasshopper. Nope, be the other side. Matt put the grasshopper on the floor for Branch, who grabbed it with his teeth and consumed it with a crunch that made Kira cringe. The nuts rolled under the bed. Matt plunged his hand into the opposite pocket and brought out something triumphantly. Here you be. He handed the thing to her. She took the folded thing curiously and plucked the dead leaf pieces and dirt away. Then, while Matt watched with delight and pride suffusing his face, she unfolded it and held it to the window light. A square of filthy, wrinkled cloth. Nothing more. And yet it was everything. Matt, Kira said, her voice hushed with awe. You found blue. He beamed. It was there, where she said. Where who said? She, the old woman who making the colors. She said there be blue yonder. He wriggled in excitement. Annabella? Yes, I remember. She did say that. Kira soothed the cloth on the table, examining it. The deep blue was rich and even, the color of sky, of peace. But how did you know where, Matt? How did you know where to go? He shrugged, grinning. I recollect that she pointed. I just followed where her point went. There be a path, but it's horrid far. And dangerous, Matt. It's through the woods. There be not fearful in the woods. There be no beast, Annabella had said. Me and Branchy, we walk for days and days. Branch, he had bugs, and me, I had some food I tooken. From your mother. He nodded with a guilty look. But it weren't enough. After it be all gone, I ate nuts mostly. I could have ate bugs if I had to, he added, boasting. Kira half listened to his tale as she continued to smooth the cloth in her hand. She had yearned so for Blue. Now here he was, in her grasp. Then when I got to the place, them people, they gave me food. They got lots. But not a bath, Kira teased. Matt scratched his dirty knee with his dignity and ignored her. They had horrid surprise to see me come, but they gave me plenty of food. Branchy too. They liked Branchy. Kira looked down at the dog, asleep now at her feet, and nudged him affectionately with the tip of her sandal. Of course they did. Everybody loves Branch. But Matt, what? Who are they? The people who have Blue? He lifted his thin shoulders and wrinkled his forehead in an expression of ignorance. Dunno, he said. Them be all broken, them people. But there be plenty of food, and it's quiet-like and nice. What do you mean, broken? He gestured toward her twisted leg. Like you. Some don't walk good, some be broken in other ways. Not all, but lots. Do you think it making them quiet and nice to be broken? Puzzled by his description, Kira didn't answer. Pain makes you strong, her mother had told her. She had not said quiet or nice. Anyways, Matt went on. Them got Blue, for certain sure. For certain sure, Kira repeated. I suppose you like me best now, I? He grinned at her, and she laughed and said she liked him best of all. Matt pulled away from her and went to the window. On tiptoe, he peered down and then out. The crowds were still there, but he seemed to be looking beyond them for something. He frowned. You like the Blue? He asked her. Matt, she said passionately, I love the Blue. Thank you. It be the small gifty, but the big one be coming soon, he told her. He continued watching through the window. Not yet, though. He turned to her. Got food? He asked. Iffen I wash? They left Matt and Branch in Thomas's room when they were summoned back to the afternoon section of the gathering. This time, they were ushered in and took their seats with less formality. There was no need for the chief guardian to introduce them to the villagers. But the singer, looking refreshed after lunch and a rest, made a ceremonial entrance again. He held his staff as he stood at the foot of the stage, and the audience applauded him in acknowledgement of his remarkable performance in the morning. His expression didn't change. He had not changed it all day. No proud smile. He simply stood gazing with intensity at the populace, the people for whom the song was an entire history, the story of their upheavals, failures, and mistakes, as well as the telling of new tries and hopes. Kira and Thomas applauded as well, and Jo, watching and imitating them, clapped her hands enthusiastically. Through the noise of the applause, as the singer turned and mounted the stairs to the stage, Kira glanced at Thomas. He had heard it too, the dull, dragging sound of metal, the same sound they had noticed in the morning before the song began. Kira looked around, puzzled. No one else seemed to notice the abrupt, heavy noise. The villagers were watching the singer as he breathed deeply in preparation. He moved to the center of the stage, closed his eyes, and fingered the staff, looking for the place. He swayed slightly. There! She had heard it again. Then, almost by accident, just for a second, she glimpsed at it. Suddenly, Kira realized with horror what the sound was. But now there was only silence, and then the start of the song.